Aloha. My name is Sabrina McKenna, and I'm honored to have been serving as an Associate Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court since 2011. Welcome to the second in our series entitled Confronting Racial Injustice, Achieving Racial Equity in Hawaii. Now, you've probably noticed that we chose to use the term racial equity instead of racial equality, and I'd like to explain why. Although both terms, equality and equity, are concerned with promoting fairness and justice, providing equality means that a person or a certain group of people is given the same attention, resources, opportunities, or treatment. The concept of equity, however, recognizes that a person or certain groups of people have different circumstances and that therefore there needs to be an appropriate adjustment of attention, resources, opportunity, or treatment. And the topic we discuss today, data and the criminal justice system, highlights why we focus on racial equity. For example, the United States incarcerates people at much higher rates than any other country. It's been reported that although we only have 5% of the global population, we have 25% of the world's prison population. As of 2018, 698 out of every 100,000 people in America were incarcerated. In fact, if each state within the United States was a country, 23 states would be the highest incarcerating countries in the world. Hawaii has the 39th highest incarceration rate of the 50 states. In 2018, 487 out of every 100,000 people in Hawaii were incarcerated in state or federal prisons or correctional centers. If Hawaii was a country and we excluded the 38 states with higher incarceration rates, however, Hawaii would be the country with the 4th highest incarceration rate in the world, with only El Salvador, Turkmenistan, and Cuba with higher incarceration rates than Hawaii. Comparing our 487 out of 100,000 number, New Zealand is at 220, China 188, Philippines 172, Australia 167, Japan 45, and India 33. So Hawaii incarcerates more than twice as many people per capita than New Zealand, China, the Philippines, and Australia, more than 10 times as many people per capita than Japan, and almost 15 times as many people per capita compared to India. What does this mean for racial equity within the criminal justice system in Hawaii? Well, like other states, our incarceration rate has ballooned over the last 4 decades with the war on drugs and the expansion of for-profit private prisons. And like the rest of the United States, Hawaii has in the past and continues to incarcerate a disproportionate percentage of people of color, who in Hawaii include Black Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Our panel today will discuss the data we have and the data we need to collect in order to achieve racial equity in different aspects of our criminal justice system. And we hope that they will also share their ideas on the achievement of racial equity. The discussion will be ably moderated by Supervising Deputy Public Defender Willie Bagasol, who co-chairs the Hawaii Supreme Court Committee on Equality and Access to the Courts. His panelists today include Steve Alm, the newly elected prosecuting attorney for the City and County of Honolulu. Steve was previously a circuit court judge, the United States Attorney for the District of Hawaii, and a supervising deputy prosecuting attorney in Honolulu. We are also privileged to have with us Dr. Radine Keahi'olalo, whose UH political science dissertation topic was the colonial, carceral, and prison politics in Hawaii. Her dissertation analyzed the historical and contemporary factors that have perpetuated and enabled the criminalization and over-incarceration of Hawaiians. Dr. Keahi'olalo's professional background includes various executive positions, and today she runs her own consulting company, Magna Rises LLC. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Aaron Harbinson. Dr. Harbinson joined us a few months ago as the first executive director of the newly created Criminal Justice Research Institute, CJRI, which is located in the office of our Chief Justice. CJRI was recently created by the legislature and is tasked with making policy recommendations regarding the criminal justice system to protect individual rights, as well as to increase efficiencies and to control costs. To do so, it is authorized to examine all areas of the criminal justice system, including police, prosecutors, defense counsel, courts, pretrial services, probation and parole, jails and prisons, as well as the manner in which related areas, including mental health services and drug treatment services, interact with the criminal justice system. Dr. Harbison's PhD is in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati. Before joining CJRI, she worked for the University of Cincinnati Corrections Institute, the Rabina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Minnesota Law School, and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. On behalf of the judiciary and all of our sponsors, I'd like to thank our esteemed and knowledgeable panelists for taking the time to address and enlighten us all. And I'd like to thank all of you for caring enough to take the time to join us. Without further ado, I turn it over to our moderator, Willie Bagasol. Aloha.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome for attending this second event on racial equity. Event number one, Black Lives Matter and the Hawaii Experience, was a very successful event and set a high bar. We hope to meet some of your expectations today, and we turn our attention now to the data and the criminal justice system. But before we start, I'd like to just remind the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. Hopefully we have some time. To begin, we have three eminently qualified panelists, and just to orient the audience to your work, can you please briefly describe what work you do or what you've done in the criminal justice system and on how you see it intersecting with today's topic? Radine, would you like to start first?
Thank you. So I've been doing this work probably for about 30 years now. And as Justice McKenna mentioned, my dissertation was looking at the overrepresentation of Native Hawaiians in prison. And one thing I want to say, the approach that I take is for every data point, there's a story that's told and a story that's not told. And so, political science, typical, I want to look at patterns in the system. I want to look at, case history. I want to look at all those things besides just the fact that 40% of Native Hawaiians are incarcerated in Hawaii versus their 20% representation in the population. And so for me, just a real quick snapshot, my dissertation, because I couldn't access the data that I needed for a quantitative study, because our data system is not really equipped to be able to provide that kind of access. I ended up analyzing case histories in the Hawaiian community and looking at, and my dissertation starts with the public hanging of Chief Kamanava, who was Lili'u and Kalakaua grandfather. And this was at a time when the missionaries were picking up speed in terms of changing the laws, and basically the hanging was a public spectacle to kind of infuse a message that there was a different kind of authority in Hawaii. So that's basically my background in a nutshell.
Radine. Prosecutor Steve, would you like to orient the audience?
Okay. I started as a prosecutor. I was the U.S. attorney. I was a judge, but I've always tried to be innovative, tried to make the system fair, impose a system of seeking justice, not just winning cases. As U.S. attorney, I chaired the Penal Code Review Committee, and we made, I think, some really good moves there. Kamaili Maldonado from OHA was part of that. We had 7 judges. defense counsel, prosecutors, but we got rid of mandatory minimums for possession of small amounts of drugs. We got rid of the methamphetamine statute in its entirety, for selling $20 bags of meth, that as judges, we had to give people 10 years in prison. As a judge, I, also started Hope Probation with Cheryl Enoy from the probation system, because our system wasn't working well. And I thought we could make it work better. And I'll share some of the data from that later. But I've always been about research and data, that we've got to make starting new programs, trying to, import some that we've seen from elsewhere. But I have a much more rounded view of the criminal justice system. So running for prosecutor seemed like a natural. There's been real problems in the office. The public didn't trust it. And so I wanted to go back to the place I started to try to make it a more equitable place, more effective, and make it a place that young deputies wanted to work. I think they wanted to go to your office more recently, Mr. Bagasol. So when I was on the bench, I think I had 3 or 4, maybe 25 law clerks, 3 or 4 that went to civil, and about half for the prosecutors and defense. But I think in the last 5 years in the bench, they all went to the public defender. So we've got to get a balance in here for that. So anyway, I'm really happy to be joining you and our other 2 great panelists.
Thank you. Aaron? Dr. Aaron?
Sure. So I started getting involved in the criminal justice field in part because I studied criminology and was really interested in the topic, but I also had done an internship quite a few years back with the legislature and in Arizona. I'm originally from Arizona. And so I really observed a lot about the policymaking process and really saw an opportunity to think about how data and research and evidence can bring information to policymakers. And over the years, as I pursued my PhD and taken different research positions and policy-oriented positions, have learned too that it's much more complex than doing a study or providing evidence and data, that there's a lot of factors that go into policy making. There's policy making at legislative levels, at administrative levels, and even in the informal, indirect things that happen through discretion on a day-to-day basis. And then beyond that too, no matter how great of a research project you have with the most important findings you could ever have, implementing those is also another challenge. And so throughout all of this experience, one of the things that I started to really recognize was that to help enact change is to kind of think about how all these pieces come together and to realize that understanding data and using data to make change also requires understanding how the system operates and not studying an agency or a policy in a silo and linking that. So when I'm really excited to be here with the Criminal Justice Research Institute, because I think it shows really great foresight by the state to recognize that to enact change, to achieve, work towards racial equity, to make a difference, to improve outcomes, it can't happen within one agency or within one area. It really requires examining the whole system. And so I think it's a really innovative approach, and just really honored and grateful to be a part of that. So, and also to be part of this panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. To begin with, I'll be calling upon each of the speakers to discuss various topics and prompts or questions. For the first one is, what are some of the relevant pieces of data in the criminal justice system, and what does it mean to us or to them? So I'd like to first start off with Radine. Given your research and studies and work, such as with the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force, what kinds of data would you like to initially highlight, and that will be helpful for us to understand the state of racial inequities as reflected in the criminal justice system? And would you mind giving us a little historical perspective?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm probably not going to answer that directly because I come from a different angle when I'm looking at data and historical trends. I think one of the things that's really interesting, I'll take, for example, the stat that I talked about earlier, which is that 40% of Native Hawaiians are incarcerated, despite 20% representation in the general population. That statistic has been put out by the Department of Public Safety since the 1980s. And, you know, one of the things that I like to kind of deconstruct things and analyze it is, first of all, why has that statistic remained consistent? And again, this is an example, and it can be generalized later. But, you know, so my question is, first of all, is that what's publicly acceptable for Native Hawaiians to be represented at twice their population in the general public? The other thing is, I question the validity of that statistic. Anybody who's gone into the prisons, like probably all of us have, know that there's much more than 40% of Native Hawaiians who are incarcerated in Hawaii or transferred out to the Arizona prisons. And thirdly, why are we not able to access more of the story through data? That's the only piece. And what happens, I think, sometimes is those kinds of data that continues to be put out publicly for decades at a time creates this, it's almost like we take it as gospel. Okay, Native Hawaiians are overrepresented. And what happens is that perpetuates a situation where we don't act on making change because we accept it and assume that it's not changeable. And so I think, you know, I'm excited about Prosecutor Ahm's statistics. One of the things that I'd like to see more of, and I was on the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force, and I will tell you that there's a part of me that is very critical about research studies and task force, because I think we've studied this to death and it's time to act. Personally, if we have another task force or another research study, I'd like to see us focus on all the recommendations that have been put out for the last 40 years and look across the board and see maybe what are the top 5 common recommendations that can actually affect change in the system. Because, you know, there is a myth, there's a fallacy that locking people up and throwing away the key is going to create public safety. It has not. And Prosecutor Ahm will talk about that. But that's generally my take on not just what important data we need, but also how we need to look at the data, question the data, analyze it, and then really start to have real conversations around what's probably not being said or done.
Thank you very much. It was quite informative reading. Steve, as the new prosecutor with extensive experience, as we come to know as U.S. Attorney and Judge, what data did you want to share, and what are some of the perspectives relating to that data? How important is it that we rely on data, evidence-based data, instead of emotions and making decisions regarding dangerousness or public safety?
Well, I think in answer to your last question, it's almost not real data, evidence-based principles are not relied on almost at all in the criminal justice system. It's all about gut feeling and intuition. And, you know, we've always done it that way and I know best. And, you know, so when I was starting at the prosecutor's office in '85, honestly, the thought was, you know, our job is to send as many people to prison for as long as possible. And that's a default position. Nobody's going to criticize you. And as I had other jobs and, you know, as U.S. Attorney and then as a judge, my whole perspective of the system has changed. But I'm very, as Radine said, very research and very practically oriented, because I was seeing on the first week on the criminal calendar, I took over Marie Milk's calendar, motions to revoke probation with recommendations of prison every time. And I realized this system wasn't working. The probation, we had good probation officers. They're all social workers. I think maybe only 30% of the POs around the country are social workers. The rest are law enforcement, which tends to follow more of a tail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em approach. But the sanctions component of it was screwed up. And I didn't need a study to tell me there were too many Hawaiians in the criminal justice system. I'm in court every day. So it's like, one thing I could control was our probation system, at least in my courtroom to start with. And so as Honolulu prosecutor, I'll bring that same kind of thinking here because I have a seat at the table again to try to do things that way. And, just briefly, there's some things that can be done statutorily. So like I said, as doing the Penal Code Review Committee, we had 84 recommendations, and getting rid of the mandatory minimums was one of them. By itself, that caused hundreds of people to be put on probation. It was discretionary with the judge now, rather than having to send them to prison. You can look at Hawaii Proning Authority stats that way. But at the same time, if we're going to put more people on probation, we've got to make that system work better. And it wasn't working well at all. The POs had total discretion over when to refer somebody back to the court. And my whole view of discretion has changed. I know the POs they're smart, they're caring judges too, but from a defendant standpoint, it is a totally arbitrary system. The PO is prejudiced, the judge is a jerk. I wasn't treated by my friend that way. So, if you're going to have fewer people in prison, more people on probation, what can we do to make that work better? So just a baseline. Let's look at the first slide that talks about crime and is it up or down? If you ask the average person on the street, I guarantee you they'll say crime is up. And that's because if it bleeds, it leads on the news. Well, when I was running for office, my opponent was trying to sell this business that crime was up. And maybe it fit into, a campaign strategy of charge every case means more people go to prison. Well, here are the stats. These are incidents reported to HPD. In July of 2019, there were 4,353 crimes, reported offenses. In June of 2020, it dropped to 3,000. That's like a 30-some% drop in crime, which when you think about it, if businesses are closed, you're going to have less shoplifting. If people are at home, you probably have fewer burglaries. But once you do have, you may see an uptick in home invasions. Now, your neighborhood may be higher. It may spike. And if you were a victim of a crime, you don't care about any of these stats. But this is the reality that crime is down. And partly I told HPD, we got to be ready that when things open up again, it is probably going to go back to the numbers they were before, hopefully not. And I think the police are citing more than arresting people. But even if the numbers go back, we could see in the paper, crime is out of control. When it's really, going back to what it was before. But to make the system more effective, I worked with Cheryl Noy from probation and figured out a way to make, probation more effective. So let's go to slide 2 that looks at the results of Hope Probation. And on the left, these are, arrests for new crimes. This is a randomized control trial study, just under 500 defendants in probation as usual, all with drug and alcohol issues. 60% were meth users. The people in regular probation got arrested for some crime 47% of the time. In Hope, it was only 21%. You can see the results, positive drug tests from 46% down to 13%. And skipped appointments. The best numbers of all are the arrests, because a 50% reduction in recidivism is unheard of. If you can get 10%, that's a champagne corking time. And this accounted for felonies, misdemeanors across the board. Probation revoked and going to prison cut in half. Interestingly enough, when you see at the bottom, the savings was all in prison beds, either sentences or served. Interesting, the jail bed days were neutral because the Hope people went every single time, 2 days, 15 days, 30 days. Regular probation didn't get any of that, but because they were arrested so much more often and had their probation revoked so much more often, were sitting for 10 weeks for their revocation hearing. Often our judges would think, I hadn't seen this person for a long time, even though they had 25 violations. So I'm going to give them another chance on probation, but give them 6 months or a year in jail as a condition of probation. I tried to talk to my colleagues about that. Don't do that. If they're really violent or dangerous, send them to prison. Otherwise, give them a month in jail, but they have nothing to do in OCCC. They sit there, there are no jobs, they can work on the food line, that's about it. There's no treatment, there's no rehabilitation going on, but that's true, was true throughout the whole criminal, the whole sentencing system. So we also looked at, how later on, when they were off probation, and this is going to be slide 3, how did they do? Were there any sustainable results? When all these people were off probation, there were 330 in the HOPE study group, 163 in the control group. And you can see the people that had been in HOPE 7 years later ended up going to prison 13% of the time. On regular probation, the control group was 27% of the time. Almost the entire savings here was new drug cases that apparently in HOPE, they really learned to stop their drug use in large part. But this is great numbers, years later, it had legs. As the violent crime and property crime were down a little bit, but not statistically significant. It was the savings in drugs. But we said, how did the Native Hawaiians do when they were, in HOPE? So this will be the next slide, the last slide. Great results there. The Native Hawaiians that had been, when they were in probation as usual, were getting revoked 26% of the time. In HOPE, it was only 15% of the time, which is still too much, but 15 is a lot better than 26%. And because the difference between HOPE and every other court innovation type of program is often those other ones are boutique systems. You deal with a small number of people. You can't help a lot of people. With HOPE, as a HOPE judge, I supervised over 2,000 felony defendants at the same time. And we bank about 3,000 here. That means 3,600 are being actively supervised. About 2,500 are in HOPE. And I was supervising 2,000 of them. That means if they were getting revoked at 42% less often, that means hundreds of Native Hawaiian men and women succeeded on probation, were able to be in the community with jobs, paying taxes or whatever, rather than being sent to prison. So I see my numbers at the bottom, were what Radine was talking about too. Native Hawaiians are about, 19, 20% of our population. And in HOPE, they were getting revoked and sent to prison at less than what their percent in the population was. So we also did a pilot in pretrial with heavyweights in the criminal justice system, Steve Raphael from Berkeley, Jens Ludwig from University of Chicago, and it showed a great outcome. People in pretrial that were under supervised release that were in HOPE got arrested for new felonies during the pretrial period, 42% less often than probation as usual. Pretrial as usual. And interestingly enough, they only got convicted of the instant offense 14% less often when they were in HOPE. So my guess is our other two panelists can figure that out better than me. All I can think of is either they were out to help their PD or private counsel investigate the case better, or they were rubbing shoulders with the jurors down at the kiosk or sitting outside and were seen as, just one of the community. But 14% was significant. That means a lot of people were not on probation or in prison later. So anyway, I'm all about, what can we do to, as a judge, certainly, and now as a prosecutor, to reduce the number of people in prison, but Native Hawaiians who've been getting the short end of the stick for a long time should get this too. We also will be looking at ways to get data out there more. Our systems don't talk to each other. HPD and the prosecutors and the judiciary, our systems don't talk. We're trying to figure out ways to do that. So anyway, that's what I have to say at this point. Thank you.
Real quick, Steve, one person asked, or there may be others that's listening, they don't know what HOPE means. In short, can you just let them know what HOPE means?
Okay, well, in regular probation, there's no mechanism to go back to court quickly. So you know, the POs don't want to and shouldn't want to send somebody to prison for a couple of dirty urine tests. So they let things slide, which of course for our probation population is not the greatest message, because they're often thinking of how to game the system. And, you know, so if they go in there, test positive for meth and then are just told, hey, you know, you got to stop using, but they walk out, it teaches the exact wrong method in hope if they tested positive for drugs in a minute, they would get 2 days in jail. The first time and the 10th time and the 15th time, I would never send somebody to prison for that. If they, you know, if they test positive and denied it, we let them go. Could be false. Lab confirms that it's 15 days. Do it on 5 weekends the first time if you're employed or working. And then if you run away and abscond, it's 30 days. Those are really the 3 basic sanctions. We're not trying to give the longer ones. We're trying to do something really difficult, and that's change people's thinking to change their behavior. I would urge people, if they want to know about HOPE, to talk to the thousands of people in the community that were in HOPE, go to the drug treatment programs. They are all huge HOPE supporters because we are helping people succeed.
Thank you, Prosecutor Steve. There's so many takeaways just from that, and you could talk about HOPE. It's kind of amazing how what can be accomplished through innovation, through focusing on the right. It doesn't have to be long-term sanctions or
No,
jail.
You're right.
And that focusing on rehabilitation, education, reintegration, and all of those things.
One of my biggest frustrations has been 32 states and now Guam, a territory, have done versions of HOPE. But my God, what was said before about implementation, you know, in Virginia, 42% of revocations happen based on 1 positive drug test or missed appointment. Another 40% based on the same thing. So 82% of their study group went to prison based on 1 or 2 violations. The judges just used it as a mechanism to send people to prison. So getting people to do this the right way is extremely difficult. You know, and I've tried to do that. And some people don't understand HOPE. They think it's only about sanctions, when it's also about caring POs, caring judges, you know, being firm, but being supportive. Anyway, it's implementation is really hard.
Thank you. Dr. Aaron, as the new director of the Criminal Justice Research Institute, do you have a response to any of the prior speakers? And what perspective do you have regarding data and how important it is, and how important data literacy is in interpreting data and how to accurately draw conclusions from them?
Sure. You know, I'll try to keep this brief because I think, you know, I'm in agreement with the prior panelists. They brought up really important issues. And, you know, from a perspective like the Research Institute, which is, you know, looking at data and how to understand the system and come up with recommendations to improve it. I think there's kind of how I view it is, just to reiterate kind of what's been said already, is one, as Radhi mentioned, you know, there's data, there's data that we can look at and share and examine, but there's also data that we either choose not to share or data that's just not available. You know, one of the things that's really hard about research in the criminal justice system is that data is not collected for research, it's collected for operations. And so given that a lot of agencies have high caseloads, a lot of times the staff entering data are the probation officers themselves, or you know, people who are tasked with day-to-day functions. It's really difficult to collect data in a way that measures the concepts that we have or want to measure. So in research, we would talk about reliability and validity of a measure. And reliability, part of that is the consistency. So is every agency or everyone within an agency collecting the same data, measuring it the same way regularly? And then there's validity. Is the data elements or the variables that we're looking at, do those actually reflect the measures that we're trying to study? So those 2 pieces are important in research, and with criminal justice particularly, it's really challenging to work with this data that's often secondary data to someone like me, and to make sense of it and to link it and to do a study. So another kind of important thing related to that is sometimes we're not able to pull systems together. If sometimes it's just impossible to merge certain things or just data's not there. So we talk a lot about recidivism rates or outcomes, and we give trends, and everything though is relative to something else. There's no magic ideal number to say that this recidivism rate is acceptable. In a real world, we would love to say 0%, but we're talking about human beings. Even in the best of situations, there's human choice. There's people are going to reoffend or make mistakes or do things. So what we're trying to understand is if we change, for instance, if we're implementing HOPE as opposed to probation as usual, do we see a meaningful reduction? If we're trying to understand, racial equity, a lot of times what we're left with doing is trying to say, well, relative to other groups, what are the outcomes that we see? And, to your point, also, Radine, about just the challenge in when we start collecting data and reporting trends is until you do it consistently over time and make a concerted effort to look at it, it's hard to make change. And especially too, if you see a trend, what's responsible for that trend, and trying to pinpoint, the issues, the areas of discretion of the policies or practices that are responsible for those disparities that we see is extremely challenging. So I'll stop there, but I just want to echo, I think everyone has brought up really important points and really explained just some of the challenges in communicating research in the criminal justice system.
Thank you. What other pieces of data would we need to help us better understand racial equities? What perhaps to make better policy decisions in improving the criminal justice system? Erin, can you continue to share how have you seen data improve criminal justice systems in other states and areas of opportunity in our own state? Would you need more data relating to more specific subgroups, or in other words, for example, disaggregate the current data, for example, between Native Hawaiians versus other type of Pacific Islander groups?
I actually have a couple of slides to share just to demonstrate some of the different ways data can be used to study this topic. To the point about collecting data and disaggregating data, again, that goes back to the idea of validity. You want data that's measuring concepts that are important to us. So in some states, race might be measured one way because the population looks different in terms of the aggregate numbers. And so, areas or groups that are focused on there might be different from state to state. So, if the goal is to really understand, racial equity here in Hawaii, then disaggregating the data might do a better job achieving that, because then you're measuring things more precisely to reflect the reality here. And that also means that different agencies, need to kind of work together to do that. Of course, then the challenge is to change data systems to do that, to train staff to do that, and to make that an overall process. So, kind of extending from that is just wanted to kind of give a sort of a case study of some research I did before in another jurisdiction on probation. And part of the research was really a bigger project about understanding probation supervision outcomes, in this case, revocation. But within that, the jurisdiction was interested in looking at racial equity within those outcomes. So this first slide is just to demonstrate what I've already said, is that data comes from different systems. So here I was trying to study probation revocations, but the blue line represents, kind of this life course of a probation sentence for someone within the probation agency. But if I wanted to understand things about sentencing or the revocation process or the violation process, that required information from the courts, which was an entirely different system, an entirely different agency, as well as if there was information from the prosecutors or public defenders about the initial sentencing or the violation hearings and revocation outcomes. In some cases, in a lot of places, those might be paper files, and it's really hard to kind of pull that information to make sense of it. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things that we do, and in this specific example, we started to look at racial equity with the data that we had, which was mostly limited to probation at the time. And though we wanted to understand revocations, we actually had to start with probation violations, because probation officers initiate that process through the violation by filing non-compliance with the court. And so even though the court just ultimately determines whether or not someone's revoked on the violation, we couldn't really look at that ultimate end decision, but at least could start here with probation. And so one of the things that we examined, and this is just to demonstrate that there's different ways to look at racial equity. So what we started with was to first, the blue bar chart is demonstrating how, oftentimes what we do is we compare people relative to others. So if we thought that people had probation violations kind of similarly across the board, had similar outcomes, that would maybe be a better representation of racial equity in that stage. And so we would see this bar chart that everyone would hover around the same percentage. But what we found in this jurisdiction specifically, that individuals who are Native American were almost double the average in terms of the violations that were filed at this particular point in the revocation process. But in the pie chart, when we looked at instead thinking about of all the violations that were submitted, a greater percentage were for individuals who are Black or African American. And so there, because this is again just demonstrating another way to look at outcomes. So the blue is demonstrating differences between groups. But in the pie chart, we're looking at, well, what numbers of people are impacted by this. And then the next slide, please. And so the next slide demonstrates how, in the prior slide, when you looked at the pie chart, it was kind of hard to say, well, what do these percentages mean in terms of racial equity? So on the right is the same pie chart showing about 44% of Black or African American individuals had violations filed. But the left pie chart is demonstrating their proportion of the population overall. So in this case, if we want to look at racial equity, we would be comparing to, you would expect the percentage of people on probation, those percentages across groups to be similar to in probation violation submissions. And in this case, as you can see, that was not the case. And what another kind of point to make was that, it was important to break this down in two different ways, because the individuals who are Native American were a very small number of people on probation. And if we hadn't looked at it in different ways, we might have missed the stark difference really in the violation rates, because there's just a smaller number within the overall sample. And so this is just to demonstrate that there are some different ways to look at this topic. But again, we're still looking at things relative to other groups or relative to other percentages or other examples. Next slide, please. And then even when we see disparities, the other challenge is what's causing them or what's related to them or impacting them. And so we looked at a bunch of different data on probation, and this is to give the example. So again, at the top, we have the rates of violations. So when probation officers file a report with the court to say someone is not compliant with their probation terms. So we look at that by race. And we see different percentages. But then also with offense level, people who were sentenced for felonies had higher rates. Different supervision units had different percentages. And so this could reflect the types of offenses those units supervise, different styles of probation officers, different office locations. There's so many different factors that go into this. So even though these trends are really helpful and provide a snapshot in our starting point, if we really want to enact change, it's really difficult to pinpoint what's going on with just these trends or a snapshot in time. Next slide, please. And this here is just to demonstrate the revocation process. And this is even as simple as I could make it. It's much more complex than this. But three things circled were on the prior slide. So probation unit, offense level, and a characteristic of the individuals on probation. Those were three things that we looked at. But there's so many other factors that impact someone and outcomes regarding revocations, or if you even want to talk about recidivism or other outcomes. And so this is, just trying to demonstrate that when we're talking about trends or we're talking about disparities, to understand why, to understand the context behind them, there's a lot of different factors at play that we want to pull together. And so to me, I think with the Research Institute, what this really highlights, it's partly with the data that you collect and being able to study these concepts, but also linking systems together to piece together how the process or how people flow through the system and how different decisions, different policies impact outcomes along the way. Next slide, please. And so my final conclusion, just on that topic, is to make the point that it's, again, partly the data that you're measuring, but also how you're linking it together to understand what's causing the outcomes that you see, whether it's about racial equity or about public safety. We really want to put these pieces together and analyze them to come up with solutions, rather than kind of refer to trends on a regular basis and kind of take those trends without that context. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we only have a few minutes, and we have a lot of ground to still cover. We have to try to wrap this up in about 12 minutes if you can. So knowing that, Prosecutor Alm, which data points do you see most important for your office, and how do you hope to incorporate the use of data into programs and policies in your office?
Well, we're going to try to see if we can start interfacing with HPD, so partly it's so we can pull the data we need, and partly it's just so our staff doesn't have to repeat putting in the same stuff that's already been put in there. But we do want to look at, how many different races come in, different ways at the beginning and at the end, things maybe we can control. I mean, but it's frustrating. I hear what the other panelists are saying here, that with HOPE, we don't know what the most important part is. We just know you need all three parts. You need caring POs, you need judges that understand addiction, are going to be consistent, but some people are going to end up in prison. And then the swift, certain, consistent, proportionate sanctions in order to make the rest of it work. But there's a huge element of caring that a lot of people misunderstand and don't get. The first words out of my mouth when people start in court were, everybody in this courtroom wants you to succeed on probation. And a lot of people would tell me over the years, nobody ever told me they wanted me to be successful. So, I mean, and that may not get reflected in the data, but it's important. And, we are going to try to look at data in different ways. And we do want to look at racial inequities just to see what's going on, because we can't tell right now. And I have to say, over the years at the prosecutor's office, there was an intention not to identify racial, because groups, we didn't want to be accused of targeting anybody. So we just tried to ignore it and never, as far as I know, and never collect that kind of data. But I think at this point, it's something that should be done, just so we can know how people are being impacted. Is it, different as far as different racial groups when the cases come in, as to how they're dealt with pleas, how they're sentenced. We got to know all that stuff for whatever it shows. And I think we will try to do that, but we got to get ourselves working with the other systems to do that.
Thank you, Steve. Redeen, do you have any comment regarding what further data or research should be helpful? Maybe the focus may be more rehabilitation or reintegration, reentry, which may be leading to the last topic about solutions. But do you have a comment about that?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I was gonna say that I think what we focus on is the very thing that we need to be mindful of. I like Prosecutor data points that he shared. I'd like to share a contrast to incarceration. I do some work with Habilitat, which is a long-term residential treatment center here on island. They just celebrated 50 years the other day. And largely due to the fact that they have a strong workforce development program with 13 different social enterprises. So they are able to take people in who can't afford treatment. And one piece of information that is astonishing to me is that it costs them roughly $2,400 a month per person to be in long-term residential treatment. And in order for that person to graduate after 28 months, they will have had been in workforce enterprises. They have marketable skills, ready to get employed, which also leads to a livable wage and safe housing. 63% of the graduates, 5 years after they leave the program, show that they're still in stable housing, fully employed, no new arrests or substance use. Now contrast that to incarceration, which costs us well over, if you include subsidiaries like phone calls, transportation, medical, and all these other things that come along with the prison system, we're looking at over $100,000 a year to incarcerate somebody. And not only do they come out without a job, they come out without access to family. They haven't been properly trained for reentry. And case in point to my my comment about us starting to look at the recommendations that have been presented over the years. One of the recommendations from the Native Hawaiian Task Force that sort of seemed like the low-hanging fruit was that anybody who's incarcerated 6 months prior to exit, they should come out with a state ID. Many of them don't have IDs. So how are they gonna apply for jobs? How are they gonna get housing? You need a passport to get your driver's license. You need your driver's license to get your passport. It's just this whole system that really creates more despair. A lot of, when you really look at the data, a lot of the people who are incarcerated right now don't need to be incarcerated. I did a study years ago, 30% were pretrial detainees who couldn't afford cash bail of a couple $100s. So their families get fractured, they lose their jobs, they come out worse than when they went in, and it just perpetuates a cycle. So I guess, Willie, my point is that let's start focusing on what really works and kind of roll up our sleeves and put our efforts there. We know what the problem is. I also want to say that I think it's going to take courageous leadership, but I think we're ready for that in this season, and it takes just a few people to lead in the right direction. And, I'm hoping that I get to continue to be a part of that. And I definitely am excited about Prosecutor being in the office because I think it brings a whole new approach and attitude that, at least in my mind, is going in the right direction.
Thank you, Radine. We need to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we could go another hour, but I'd like to end with, and Radine sort of started talking to us about recommendations and suggestions. Do you knowing what we know already, are there some things that we should just implement? What kinds of things that should we start implementing? Should we look at pretrial bail reform again? Should we look at the issue regarding mass incarceration? Should we look at more rehabilitation programs? What kind of suggestions do you have in the closing moments of this webinar? Radine, is there something else that you think that you wanted to say that maybe low-hanging fruit, or some action that we can take now, or actions?
You know, I definitely like to see more money, more of our taxpayer dollars going into reentry and education. I think for, you know, every dollar we spend in criminal justice, you need to know that that takes away from public education, social welfare, public health. Um, I would like to see a start in that and going in that direction. Like I said, low hanging fruit, things like getting people prepared when they come out of prison. I'd like to see cash bail gone. Um, I think we need more community custody so that people can continue their lives while they're being accountable. And I think that, you know, there is a disproportionate amount of punishment. I'm not talking about lack of culpability. If somebody does something, if they do the crime, they should do the time, right? But the time is usually excessive. And that's what we're dealing with. And then lastly, I would say we need to look at mandatory minimums. It's just is not working.
Thank you. Steve, do you have, would you like to handle that question?
Yeah, I would, you know, agree. We've already started with that process, and it was a game changer, I think, as far as getting rid of those mandatory minimums. I think we should expand the specialty courts, but the special, you know, drug court, mental health court, veterans court, but they should be focusing on the higher risk offenders, not the easy pretrial cases. They can be helped in regular probation or hope. There also should be money spent on rehabilitative programs, classes in prison for the folks that get sent there. I've talked to inmates who say, I'd rather go to Saguaro, to this private prison. I'll be cut off from my family, but at least there are a lot of programs I can take. COVID is screwing all of that up. But apart from that, I was hearing that from a bunch of inmates, and that is ridiculous. We shouldn't be sending people out of prison, out of state to do their time anyway, but we need to get more programs in our state prison systems.
Thank you. Aaron, there was one question that was posted on the Q&A, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to many of them. But one in particular, Aaron, one person asked, I mean, is the next step, you know, getting more data, or should we, you know, is there some kind of initiatives, or some of these initiatives that we should just start acting upon already, or should we do both? What's your take on that? How would you answer that question?
Sure.
And in relationship to solutions. Recommendations.
Yeah, I think so far it's a little of both. I mean, in some ways, the suggestions and recommendations brought up thus far, those aren't just. I mean, they're consistent with what research and evidence would suggest more broadly, that treatment, when we're providing treatment to people, is more effective in the community than while people are incarcerated. Certainly there's situations in which incarceration might be appropriate. But if we're thinking about the greater returns, or the largest effect that we can make in reducing reoffending and future crime, the community is a better place for it. And for some people, when you incarcerate people, there's a lot of evidence demonstrating that those consequences carry long-term consequences around education and employment. And those are the very things that also prevent someone from returning to the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of different research and evidence around you know, the drug courts, or you know, programs in the community, and what's effective. And I think around, you know, what works with reentry. And so there's a lot that can be done. But then, yeah, I think there's also opportunities to explore. I think with everything that's been happening, there's a lot of innovation that has been happening with, you know, less monitoring, less surveillance, remote ways to do things that might reduce barriers that typically people face. And there might be ways to evaluate that and learn from that to carry those lessons long term to maybe produce some more efficient ways of doing things, but still do them safely and effectively.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we have to start wrapping this up, and I'd like to thank the panelists for coming on board and spending so much time. And I know we just scratched the surface, but we just don't want to, you know, talk, but we also want to continue this discussion and actually do something about it and move things forward. So toward that end, we don't want it to stop here. So toward this end, I'd like to invite everyone else back, in the audience, and invite your friends. 2 Fridays from now, on February 12th, we'll have a discussion regarding civil rights and access to justice. This will be moderated by retired Judge Joseph Cardoza, and the panels will be Dina Sheck from the Medical Legal Partnership, Bill Hushijo from the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission, and Rebecca Libowitz from the Legal Aid Society. You will need to register separately to attend that particular section, or that particular, and that registration is in the chat box. So I hope to see all of you back. Happy Fred Korematsu Day tomorrow, and aloha to everyone.